Now, could Muhammad have been a true prophet of God? Yes, Muhammad could have been a true prophet of God. How would we know whether Muhammad was a true prophet of God or a false prophet that Jesus said would come? And the Bible in the Old Testament gives the way of determining that. It says this: if a prophet of God agrees with the prophets that annodate him, then he would be considered to be a prophet of God. If what a prophet says comes to pass, then he's to be considered a prophet of God. If what he says violates the prophets of old and does not come to pass, then he's to be considered a false prophet. So now when we take a look at Muhammad, where we first have to start to look is in the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, it talks about the coming Messiah. The Jewish people today that have rejected their Messiah, Jesus Christ, still look for a Messiah to come. They're waiting for a Messiah to come because the Old Testament is real clear. There's going to be a Messiah that's going to come. He says in the Old Testament that it's the Son of God. It says that he's going to come, that he's going to die, and that he's going to raise again. Now in the New Testament, Jesus said that he was the Son of God. He said he was God. He said he was going to die, and he said that he was going to raise from the dead. In the New Testament, the apostles say that they saw Jesus. They saw him heal the blind. They saw him heal the deaf. They saw him walk on water, and they saw him raise from the dead. They also saw him put to death, and they also saw him raise from the dead, and they also saw him ascend through the heaven. That's the human testimony. Now, Muhammad comes 600 years after Jesus Christ, and he says that Jesus was a truth teller. The prophets were truth tellers. All of them were truth tellers. But he says, I do not say to you that mine are the treasures of God, nor that I even know the unseen. But all these guys are truth tellers. But then he makes a very serious mistake. He says that Jesus Christ is not the Son of God. He's not God. And he did not raise from the dead. And so therefore, when we compare what Muhammad said about Jesus Christ, he said he was a good teacher, but he said he was not the Son of God, and he didn't raise from the dead. And he definitely was not God. And when we compare what Muhammad said with what Jesus said, which Muhammad says is a truth teller, and when we compare with what Muhammad said with the prophets that Muhammad says are truth tellers, they don't mix. They don't mesh up together. They're not in line. So therefore, we have to conclude that Muhammad is a false prophet, the very false prophet that Jesus Christ spoke of in Matthew 24, one of them, that would come in the last days.
But we believe also Jesus will come back. But how come the God died?
We say the Jesus is the God.
Yes.
And we believe Muhammad said that Jesus is not the God. Jesus is a prophet like me. Muhammad said that Jesus
I know.
You said that Jesus is the God.
Yeah.
If Jesus is the God, why he is died?
Okay, let me show
Why
you.
is that?
Okay, the reason he died was this, because man had sinned against God, and God wanted to provide a savior for mankind, and rather than to appoint somebody else, because of God's loving nature, God chose to become his own savior for the mankind. God chose to become the sacrifice for the sins of mankind. And that's why God came down here to the earth. And that's why God died on the cross for the sins of the world. And in the Old Testament scriptures here, not the New Testament scriptures, it's very clear, and I'll just read to you and what it says here in the book of Isaiah. In the book of Isaiah, which is quoted in the Quran numerous times. And in this book, in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, it says this. It says, for a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest upon his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. Talking of the Messiah talking of the Jesus Christ, and that's exactly what we Christians call Jesus Christ, the mighty God, the eternal Father, the Prince of Peace. That is not what Mohammed calls Jesus Christ. That's where the difference lies. That's where the separation lies. That makes sense to you?
You don't.
Okay.
The guy has no son.
Go ahead. It's possible that Jesus was this really great guy that came down, okay, and he said a lot of really good things. He meant a lot of. He said everything he said was good, but it's possible that he didn't actually die, but went into a coma. And back in those days, they thought he was dead, and he came out of the coma and then was put to death. So he was a good person, but not quite, still not truly the Son of God.
And I agree with you that there's a lot of possibilities. Okay, there's a lot of ifs and there's a lot of possibilities. But the point of it is we have to stick with what we know. And we know that there were people on this planet Earth, whether we want to go to Christian sources or whether we want to go to non-Christian sources, we know that there were people on this earth that said that there was this guy, that Jesus, that they hung on the cross, they put into a tomb. His followers said that he rose from the dead, and they saw him at one point over 500 people. And then those very same people that claimed that they saw him die and raise from the dead actually were told to either reject that message of the resurrection or die in the lion's den or in boiling oil or with their cut off heads. And they chose to die for the testimony that they saw Jesus live, die, and raise from the dead. And it's inconceivable that someone would die for that unless they knew for sure what they saw. And that's why it rocked the world, and that's why we date it 1994. That's why we celebrate Christmas and Easter. It's because of what Christ did.
But it's not strange to think that somebody would die for that. Even nowadays, people die for it all the time. But wait, back in those times, what they don't explain so much is what's been going on in their culture and their government and their economies. That's possible. If these people wanted to change their way of life, their culture, which many people today want to change the American culture. And they fought for it, and they actually were willing to die for it.
You could die for a lie if you were deceived. No question about it. There are people today that will die for a lie if they're deceived. But we're talking about people that claim that they saw it with their own eyes. And we're not talking about one person. We're not talking about 10 people. We're talking about 500, thousands of people said that they saw the guy alive, they saw him dead, and they saw him alive again. And they weren't going to deny that truth. And they came from all different age groups, all different backgrounds. And they said, hey, I'm sorry, I cannot discard what I saw. I know. That's why in the book of Luke here, listen just to the first verse of the book of Luke, and these people were no different than you or me in many respects.
People today still die. Like the Jews all died in the Holocaust for what they believed. The Tibetans are dying.
I know, but this was a different deal. These people had the choice to live or die. Live or die, because all they'd have to do is deny that they saw, that they knew that Jesus rose from the dead. All they would have had to say...
The Inquisition was the same thing.
Excuse me, there.
The Inquisition was the same thing. The Inquisition
Thank you.
was the same.
Okay, well, let me read to you this. I want you to understand the heartbeat of these guys. This is Luke, and this is the way he writes. And just picture maybe you as Luke, or you as Luke. This is the kind of guy he was. Listen to his words. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word have handed them down to us. It seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out to you in consecutive order. These are not a bunch of people that appear to be very gullible, insecure people that were duped. They're people like you. If you saw a guy that died on a cross and then came back to life, and you felt he was your Savior, would you die for him? Yes, but if you didn't see him raised from the dead, all you seen was died on the cross, but you didn't see him raised from the dead, and someone came up to you and said, listen, I'm going to kill you unless you deny that this thing about Jesus raising from the dead, you might say, hey, wait a second now. I know that he died, but I believe he rose from the dead, but I don't know for sure he rose from the dead. They say, okay, you can live. As long as you're not saying that you know for certain that he rose from the dead. But the minute you say that he rose from the dead for certainty, then you're going to die.
different story.